Hi and welcome to Feature Fridays. My name is Guy Bartram, and today, as usual, I'm joined by Jörg. So Jörg, do you want to introduce yourself for the people who might have missed any previous sessions we've done?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my name is Jörg Lev, based out of Germany, and I work as a technical product manager in VMware Cloud Provider Software Business Unit.
Excellent, thanks Jörg. And for those who don't know me, I'm the product marketing manager for the Cloud Director suite of products. And today we're going to be talking about one particular kind of auxiliary component, a plugin to Cloud Director, which is Container Service Extension, and 2.6.1 was released alongside the same sort of time frame as VMware Cloud Director 10.1. And it brought a whole load of interesting capabilities there around things like updates and other stuff we're going to go through today. So we're just going to have a brief introduction of what CSE is all about, Container Service Extension. We'll call it CSE from now on, and how it fits into VCD, and then we'll dive into a bit of a demo. So Jörg, do you want to just kind of maybe start with some positioning of what exactly CSE is all about?
Yeah, so CSE is an extension to Cloud Director that allows service providers to offer Kubernetes clusters as service to their tenants. The idea is that as a provider, you set up all the CSE environment with the backend and the integration as API integration and UI plugin into Cloud Director. And then you can create and manage templates of Kubernetes clusters in a VCD library. And your tenants, or then you can publish them to tenants that you want to offer that service to. And then as a tenant user, I can use either a command line interface or the tenant portal in Cloud Director to self-service create Kubernetes clusters natively into my OrgVDC. And the CSE backend then does all the automation of setting up the cluster, and we will see that in the demo, to even create the config files for the regular Kubernetes clients that you then can use. So there's a very easy way for a provider to offer Kubernetes services to the tenants.
Okay, that's great. And the plugin, it used to be just kind of API only, I think, and now we have actually, like you said, we have a tenant UI for going in, seeing cluster status, creating clusters, et cetera, yeah?
Yeah, so the strategy with CSE from the beginning was to target, obviously, developers as a target group who do app development based on Kubernetes architecture and put their components in containers. So a lot of them use the deployment in some automated way, all the APIs that Kubernetes and the benefits that Kubernetes provides to that. So the main focus was really to start from providing strong APIs that can be used for that, and a command line interface that makes it very easy to consume that in an automated fashion, or just as part of your deployment and your regular handling in the development environment. But since Kubernetes get more and more, let's say, common use, and the roles might differ in a tenant scenario where you have a tenant admin that's responsible to interact with the provider to create the resources, and then you have the actual end user, the developer end user in this case, who uses just the provided Kubernetes cluster. We also added some UI functionality that makes it just more simple to create and manage the clusters and make them visible in the tenant portal in Cloud Director.
Got it. So is it right to say then that the CSE function is really as a proxy to some of the kubectl sort of commands that a developer would run?
Yeah, almost. The CSE extension is a proxy, or wraps a lot of API commands towards the Cloud Director API to create the clusters and set them up with the guest customization so that they fit into the OrgVDC network with all the IP address settings, and configure the VApp in a way that it can work and is connected to the OrgVDC networks that you've defined. But from there, the consumer or the user, the tenant user, can use the cluster as any other Kubernetes cluster using the regular network connection to that cluster.
Got it. Okay. And so from a service provider's point of view, obviously here we're dealing with native Kubernetes clusters, so there's all of the kind of management that they need to manage on top of that for monitoring, reporting of the clusters, right?
Yeah, so that is something where we just use the huge ecosystem that we have for around Kubernetes. The clusters are meant to be deployed and managed within the tenant space. So it's the tenant has more or less full admin access to the clusters. There are some very nice additions that make it easy for tenants to, for example, upgrade versions into in the cluster. So that's something that we introduced in the latest CSE version. But the idea is really that the tenant admin sort of is an administrator role for the Kubernetes cluster, and they can use whatever tools that they want from the huge Kubernetes ecosystem to manage that cluster. So we do have, of course, from a provider level, the provider also has some visibility into which clusters will be or are deployed by the different tenants, and they also can use all the the integrations that we have, for example, with utilise operations or things like that, to monitor the cluster utilizations.
So this was something then that could have been done before, but it would have been done manually. It would have been done on VMs that were deployed, and also you wouldn't have had the extra kind of cluster management functionality that we're now overlaying on top, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So in past, you as a provider would provide like some basic Linux templates in the library, and then the tenant user can deploy the basic Linux operating system, and then they would have to log in and set up all the Kubernetes infrastructure into these guest operating systems. And typically, since we are talking about Kubernetes clusters, they usually have a whole bunch of different nodes, master nodes, worker nodes, and so on, some storage nodes, so a lot of different components that in past you could install all of that manually into the different systems, but it takes a long time. And all that functionality to create these clusters with the different features and the individual virtual machines, that is all done fully automatically by CSE. So cluster creation is a very simple single either UI wizard or a single command line.
So what we're really offering then from a provider's perspective is with CSE, if you take the base kind of capabilities, we're offering Kubernetes as a service with some extra bells and whistles around upgrading components and being able to provision stuff from a UI.
Exactly.
As well as API.
Yeah, to make it as easy as possible for the tenant users to create these Kubernetes clusters, so that we can, as a provider, you can attract and offer these services mainly for tenants that want to deploy Kubernetes style applications.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so how does a provider kind of find the plugin? How does the install work? What type of things do they need to consider?
Okay, so for that, let's switch over to the demo environment.
Okay.
So the Container Service Extension for Cloud Director is an open source project that is maintained and sponsored by VMware engineers. So some part of our Cloud Director engineering team is responsible for developing and maintaining the CSE extension. But it is an open source project that you can find on GitHub. So the repository is visible on GitHub. When you just go to the VMware Container Service Extension repository, you can see the whole source code here. You can also see that there are a lot of community aspects around that. So we have the issues section here that is directly monitored by our engineers, and you can create and of course contribute to the CSE code as well if you want to. From a consumer perspective, you can also see all the different releases that we have for Container Service Extension in past, and with the GitHub docs, you can also consume and view the documentation of the CSE environment.
So this is much like the Terraform plugin as well, right? Where it's all
that's
publicly available.
Comparable. It's a VMware-sponsored open source project that, in the same way as Terraform, is, by the way, fully supported by our GSS support as well.
Okay, great.
Yeah, to install it, you have to understand the different components that we have in a CSE environment. That means we have obviously Cloud Director with the different extension framework that is used here for API extensions and for UI extensions. And then when you install CSE as a provider, you install a Python module on an additional server component that provides all the automation functionality. This hooks into VCD as an API extension. Technically use it AMQP extensions. And then you have two different ways for the client to interact with that server. One is the CSE client, which is part of the regular VCD command line interface that we provide, also as an open source project, by the way, or the new UI plugin that makes the certain functionality like cluster creation and a basic view of the existing clusters available in the tenant portal.
Yeah.
For the installation, well, it's all based on Python modules, so you can use the Python package manager to install the components. However, you have to make sure that you fulfill a certain set of requirements. So these, since the CSE client components, for example, is based on the VCD CLI Python modules, you have to install them and so on. For that, there are some blog articles out there from some of our colleagues. For example, on virtualizationteam.com, there is one very good and active regular description of CSE extension 261 step by step, which also covers all the caveats and the requirements how to get there from a basic Linux installation.
Okay, great. Yeah, and Iyad has actually got a YouTube video as well around some of the CSE functionality, so it's quite a handy.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let's see how it looks like from a from a management perspective. A lot of the things that you do in a CSE environment as a provider are more or less one-time view. So when you set up CSE, you set up these server components, the Python modules, and then you create templates for these Kubernetes clusters. All of that can be done just through regular command line, and the commands that you need to run to do this are very well described here in the documentation. So you have one section about the CSE server management, where you can see the commands, and then there's the section about the Kubernetes template management, which are interesting because that's the idea that you as a provider get these templates and prepare them and publish them into the catalogs.
Right. So you can make then you get to define the service that you're going to provide basically for the tenant.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. And CSE also follows that, well, the paradigm of multi-tenancy in Cloud Director, obviously. So there is a pretty fine-grained permission model and role-based access control available in CSE that, first of all, allows you as a provider to selectively offer certain templates or the whole CSE Kubernetes as a service functionality to different tenants, which allows you to perhaps monetize this service or have some different levels of service for your different tenants. But then there's also a role-based access model available that the tenant administrator can use, so they can define different roles in Cloud Director to use these Kubernetes clusters. So cluster creation, cluster consuming, and so on. You can do some very fine-grained role-based access control for that.
So an organization could define its kind of, I don't know, developer, admins, and users, and other resources they would want to be able to create and manage the clusters themselves.
Exactly, yeah. And that is done technically by using the regular role-based access control in Cloud Director with the permission rights bundles that you as a provider can configure and then sort of propagate them to the tenant admin to use them within their tenant organization.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay, now, well, I guess let's see how it looks like from the UI perspective first before we get into the details of the API and command line usage. So once you have CSE installed, the server component installed and integrated as an extension with Cloud Director, one of the next steps is to publish the plugin. So that is something that you now can do through the UI in the Cloud Director plugin management. In my case, I already prepared that. So you upload the plugin zip file that you get from the GitHub repository. And then, as usual, you can in the configuration of that plugin, select to which of the tenants you want to publish the UI plugin. So which of the tenants should have the view of the Kubernetes clusters. In my case, I've published that to tenant T1. We're going to use that for a for the further demo. As a provider, there's also some notion from a provider perspective. So you can here see once the button is published, we have a Kubernetes Container Clusters section in the menu, where you can see sort of the whole view from all of your different tenants and the Kubernetes clusters that they deploy. As a provider, which gives you an overview of the deployed usage of these CSE extension. But of course, you would use the regular ecosystem monitoring tools around Kubernetes to get more details from that. Now let's switch over to a tenant perspective. So I'm switching my browser window here, and I'm going to log in as a tenant administrator now. So that's the regular tenant portal we have in Cloud Director, where we can see our org VDCs, and within the different org VDCs, the VApps and virtual machines. And if the provider will publish the UI plugin for me, then I also see that Kubernetes Container Clusters section here. In our case, I already prepared one for further demo purposes, but if you want to create a new one, you can do that pretty easily through the UI using that add wizard here to create a new cluster. You select the org VDC in which you want to deploy the new cluster, and then you have some basic settings for the cluster. So most important, the name of the new cluster, and then you can define some more specifics like the size, how many worker nodes you want, how large you want to have the nodes with the number of CPUs and memories. You could define a special storage profile for them. You can define an SSH key to be able to log in to the nodes if you want that. There's a way to very easily create some persistent storage in the clusters. So if you enable that NFS checkbox here, then it deploys an additional node that acts as a storage node for the cluster.
Okay.
And so on. But it's very easy. All this stuff is optional, so I just leave the default settings here.
What's the rollback about?
The rollback is about the if something goes wrong during the deployment, like you run out of capacity for certain things, if you want to have the whole cluster deleted and
I see.
Start again, or if you want to be able to troubleshoot manually.
Okay.
Yeah, then you can connect to your org network.
So just to be sure, when you're doing that rollback, and if you do select then to continue manually, and you do the rest of the deployment manually, will VCD pick up the or CSE? Sorry, will it pick up the cluster as there?
Yeah, so you would have to use the CSE commands to do further troubleshooting, like figuring out what's wrong with the nodes, and then depending on the state and the flavor of the error, something, usually it makes sense to sort of start from scratch. But if there's something wrong, I don't know, with guest customization, some network connections, things like that, that might be something that you can just fix inside the guest operating system without change of any of the structures that CSE recognizes.
Okay.
Then in the next step, you can select a template. I mentioned that as a service provider, you can provide different templates based on different Linux operating systems. So we have one for the VMware Photon Linux operating system, and some templates available that you could create and publish based on Ubuntu Linux with different Kubernetes and network brief components versions in there. I'm going to select the template version, get an overview of what I'm selected, and hit the finish button here. And then in background, the UI will trigger CSE to create a new VApp in the environment. You can see creates a new VApp and then deploys a whole bunch of virtual machines that belong to that cluster to that Kubernetes cluster into the org VDC.
So it's nicely contained through its own VApp then, the entire
Yeah.
cluster.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, I already deployed one before. So when we have a look at the VApp section here, you can see the new one that we just created, which is still sort of powered off and being created. The other one, Demo Cube, that's the one that I already prepared for further demonstration, where you can see that's one VApp with a connected to the specific org network, and that has a set of virtual machines in there, smallest useful configuration more or less, with one master node and 2 worker nodes in Kubernetes environment. But from there, well, they are obviously regular VApps and virtual machines in Cloud Director, but since they act as a Kubernetes cluster and there's another, let's say, infrastructure layer, typically you don't really touch these VMs here through the tenant port, because they now belong to the Kubernetes cluster infrastructure, and you would rather consume them and use them and configure them through CSE if you want to change, I don't know, the size and add some multiple worker nodes, for example. Or, of course, if you want to deploy some application, you would use the regular kubectl commands and Kubernetes management inside the cluster to use that.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, with that.
And when you're deploying that package, I mean, I noticed there was Weave there. You could then select the other components that you wanted as a provider to be, a part of the package that's available in.
Yeah, so that's the template management. So you as a provider would create these templates that you want to publish into the catalog.
Right.
And then once they are installed as Kubernetes clusters, they are plain Kubernetes clusters, and CSE does not care about the details and the stuff or additional management components or things like that you install inside the Kubernetes cluster. So CSE is sort of the connection layer that automates the deployment of the Kubernetes cluster in a Cloud Director org VDC. But from there, it's just a regular Kubernetes cluster. So you can use, I don't know, for example, install some of the Bitnami components that allow to deploy Bitnami images directly into Kubernetes clusters, or you can create or use Helm for Helm chart deployment of Kubernetes applications and so on.
So as a provider, then, if you have Bitnami, for example, you could create your image for your template. You can include base components like Weave. You could then complement this with additional value-add applications like creating your own registry, for example. Yeah, okay, that makes sense, right?
Yeah,
and then you can.
That's thinkable.
Yeah, okay. So you get a really broader service offering, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have, well, in the Kubernetes ecosystem, there are some partners or vendors out there that also have their own integration sort of on top of CSE with Cloud Director, for example, Nirmata, which is a pretty powerful Kubernetes management that also has some, as an example, some integration into the Cloud Director UI.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's see about our cluster now. While we're talking, we can see that we have 2 clusters now up and running. And if we select this cluster, you can see we can access some of the basic information about the cluster, like the size. We can see worker nodes is still 0 here because they are still being deployed and customized in background. We can see for the details, again, the organization, the original CSE template. And for the nodes, once they're set up, you can see the details of the individual worker nodes.
And you've got the kube configuration there. Is that something you could use then to configure and run the management tasks you want? Okay.
So that's the most comfortable thing of the whole UI, to be honest. Because with that one, if you click here, let me just go back to the other cluster that's already fully deployed.
Yeah, get a full configuration.
Here. Yeah. So here we can see the worker nodes, and in the node section you can see more details. with the IP addresses and so on. And if I download that kube configuration, that downloads a YAML file that can be directly used in kubectl. So I have my download file here, and I'm just going to open that with Notepad so that we can see. And you can see that's a regular kubectl configuration file that includes already the IP address and the access to the server management, and well, the context that you how you access that cluster.
That's nice little
config
feature.
File, absolutely, and this config file you then can use to use your regular kubectl commands. So you would set typically a reference to this file as a as command line parameter or as an environment variable, and then you can use your regular kubectl commands to access the cluster and yeah, run some things in the cluster.
Yeah.
So some example here. So you're connected.
So as an administrator, if you were setting up Kubernetes clusters for your developer organization, you were doing it through the UI here. You could then just pass them this file and off they go.
Yeah, that's exactly the plan. So that's where we have this different roles and responsibilities typically. And for a tenant admin that sort of manages the org VDC, that's where you hand it over to the developers. And once they get the kubectl configuration file, they can use their kubectl commands to get the list of the nodes and create namespaces and yeah, deploy applications there.
Now I know Jörg, there was some updates in 2.6.1 of CSE around encrypting configuration files.
So that's something on a provider level, because when you install CSE, the configuration and the whole sort of configuration of the server component of CSE is stored in a single command line file. And I can show here in a second. So I'm here on the CSE server, where you use the CSE command line tool to, for example, do the template management. And I just ran that. So there's one config YAML file that shows the configuration. And in older versions, and you still optionally can do that. So mine is still configured, not encrypted.
Yeah.
But you can see here that we have some clear text passwords for VCD and for vCenter in the config file. And that's something in the latest version that allows you optionally to encrypt that with some symmetric encryption.
Yeah, you have to use a switch, I think, on the install, or you can encrypt existing files with the switch as well, I think.
Exactly, yeah. So that's documented very well in the CSE server management page, I think.
I just mentioned it because I thought, looking at the download that you had of the cluster configuration, there was obviously, cert tokens there as well, which is important too.
Yeah. So these are, yeah. So that's a different component. That's sort of the certificate-based access to the actual Kubernetes server. Let's see. I think somewhere in the documentation you can find about the file encryption.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, one other addition that we had as in 2.6 was the ability to upgrade clusters, existing clusters, as a tenant. So that's very powerful. So switching over now to the command line here, we saw the kubectl command. That's already the step to get into the Kubernetes cluster and use that to, I don't know, deploy applications, for example, or manage workloads inside the cluster. If you want to interact with the cluster itself and have some options for the cluster, that's where you use the VCD CSE command line tools. So for example, you can do VCD CSE, say, cluster list, where you get the list of your clusters, and then you can do certain tasks on that cluster that are also documented in the documentation. So the different commands that you have available, there's I can show you. That's a pretty nice list here in the Kubernetes cluster management. So all the things that start with VCD CSE. You can see here we can create a new cluster. That's something we did through the UI, but you of course can also do that through the command line with one single command line command. And then you can resize the cluster, add some additional nodes to increase the cluster, to scale out the cluster, for example. You can get some more details about the cluster, and that's the new thing, you can do some upgrades on the cluster. So when you have a cluster that's up and running, you can do a VCD CSE upgrade plan, and then the cluster name. And I think in this case, I have one that's already up to date. Yeah, so it tells me no valid upgrade targets for the cluster, but if there would be some new version available that user provider sort of allow customers to use, then it would create an upgrade plan, and depending on the components that have to be upgraded, you either need a bit more downtime or almost no downtime, and use that command to upgrade the components inside the cluster.
I was going to say, so you can upgrade individual components, can you upgrade, for example, Docker if you needed to within the cluster through CSE, or is that?
Yeah, so that's a plan of the whole sort of configuration, and depends on the different upgrades that are available. But it usually always upgrades the whole set of components. And in the documentation, you can see the different components that are currently supported, like the Docker engine, the Weave network components, and the Kubernetes components themselves. And then depending on which parts are planned for the upgrade, depending on that, you would need some downtime.
Okay, and what's the advantage of using this CSE upgrade functionality versus doing it yourself, doing it manually? Is there any advantage?
Yeah, so the advantage is that here it's an additional service that user provider can offer, because the when you can read here through the requirements, it's all based on the templates, that the CSE templates that the provider offers and publishes to the tenant. So you as a provider can create or prepare these different templates with the different versions of the components, and then publish them to the tenants. And then the tenant can use the simple CSE cluster upgrade plan and single CSE cluster upgrade to upgrade these components without the need of having to check about interop, see the certain versions that they want to jump in, and do all the upgrades manually inside the cluster. So it's a very easy way for a tenant to upgrade a cluster to a different level, using sort of the benefits that the provider already did the testing and created these templates for me.
Got it. That makes sense. Okay, so that's quite a significant benefit then, really.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and it follows this model. Of course, since you as a tenant admin, I have full admin capabilities to that cluster, but that's some additional benefit that you as a provider can offer to your tenants to make it as easy as possible to work and deal and operate these Kubernetes clusters.
Got it. Okay, that's great. Okay, so we've seen around the kind of the UI management, seen a bit of the API here. Is there anything else to CSE to zoom in on?
So we've seen the UI capabilities. I mean, there are a lot of more commands available on the command line, both for the provider and the tenant users, but they follow just the typical, let's say the typical tasks that you would do with such a cluster environment. Like I mentioned, the scaling to add additional cluster nodes, worker nodes to an existing cluster. You might add a node that acts as an NFS server to have some persistent storage, for example. Or as a provider, you would create additional templates and then publish these templates to the different tenants.
Yeah. So I think as a provider, this is a really interesting offering, especially if you combine it with Bitnami and App Launchpad. And the granularity of roles, like you say, you're not going to get necessarily developers using a UI, but you're going to get the tenant admins setting up clusters, setting up resources, the guys who are going to be in charge of the consumption of the organization. Equally then, I think setting up a sort of private registry and life cycle management tools, whatever you're going to use, I think it's fantastic to have that combined and all available within VCD.
Absolutely, yeah. And the idea is to, again, we want to make it as easy as possible for tenants to consume cluster resources, obviously, or VDC resources. And having CSE is a very simple way. I mean, we have seen the installation using the Python commands and the documentation around that, but that's a one-time effort that you as a provider have to do to set it up once, which might take a few hours to set everything up. But from them, you can really offer Kubernetes as a service to your tenants without any additional day-to-day maintenance or service request effort, to put it this way. So it's a very easy way for you as a provider to just add Kubernetes into your catalog of service offerings. And then for the tenants, they can consume these clusters very easily and very easily provide Kubernetes environments to their developers for the application development.
Which is perfect. I mean, this is what people are looking for, except within their own VMware cloud, rather than it being potentially on a hyperscale cloud, having the applications to provide all of the developers environments, having now Kubernetes natively within the Cloud Director scope, and being able to provide these services. It's like differentiating your portfolio. It's more pull through from a consumption perspective, and like you say, they're just basically just turning it on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and since the clusters run inside an org VDC and you manage them as a tenant through your tenant portal, they of course integrate or connect very well to the different org networks that you might have. So it's a very good way to not only get, let's say, a pure Kubernetes environment, but also to connect it to some other VApps or other VMs that are running in the environment. And if we think about especially App Launchpad, where you can use all these Bitnami images to deploy other apps or database servers or things like that you typically don't have as containers, but really has as stateful virtual machines, you can very easily as a tenant deploy them into your org network, and then the containers that run in such a CSE-based Kubernetes cluster can integrate and access that very easily.
Brilliant. So you've got a place not only for your kind of developer playground, you've got a place to provide production level applications and continuous releases and all of the good stuff that modern architectures are promising.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're fantastic. Thank you so much for the demo. This has been, really interesting to see. We'll publish some links in the description as well to help customers find more information about this. But again, thank you very much for running through the demo and really appreciate your time.
Sure, you're welcome. See you next time.
Cheers.